It is a peculiar habit of the English countryside to wrap its strangest deeds in the softest weather, and so it was that Lord Peter Wimsey, tall, straw-haired, and wrapped in a camel-hair coat so fine it offended the entire Midlands, first encountered the business at All Souls Vicarage under a mild drizzle and the smell of daffodils crushed by careless clerical boots. "It always rains," he remarked to Bunter, who stood behind him like a well-pressed shadow holding a picnic basket that none would ever eat from, particularly on days when bodies are discovered in vestries. The Almighty, I suspect, is a dramatist. Bunter, whose theological commentary was limited but precise, said only, "Indeed, my lord." The telegram had arrived that morning at Piccadilly, crumpled and misspelled in that charmingly urgent way rural communications often are. "Dead body found in vestry. Stop priest. Unresponsive. Stop local constable useless. Stop please advise. Stop vigorously. Yours Rev. F.S. Motherwell." The Reverend Motherwell, an old schoolmate of Wimsey's from Oxford, had once nearly been expelled for turning the cathedral's wine supply into a port-tasting symposium. That he was now the head of a sleepy Norfolk parish was either a tremendous redemption or a worrying lapse in diocesan discernment. The vicarage at All Souls, tucked somewhere between a dying orchard and an aggressively Anglican graveyard, was, as one might expect, creaking floors, earnest wallpaper, and an alarming number of samplers stitched by maiden aunts with pious intentions and little taste. It was into this domestic museum that Wimsey stepped, umbrella still damp and eyebrows arched, and was greeted with the familiar voice of chaos in clerical form. "My dear Peter," bellowed Motherwell, whose cassock was speckled with what Wimsey hoped was only candle wax. "Thank heaven! The constable thinks it's apoplexy, but I say murder. You'll love it. Ghastly business, simply ghastly." Wimsey removed his gloves with the delicacy of a man unwrapping ancient papyrus. "I don't know that one is meant to love murder, dear fellow. It does rather give the criminal the wrong idea. But where is this apoplectic corpse?" "Follow me," said the vicar, leading them through a narrow passage that smelled of hymnals and damp stone. "I found him this morning, Canon Arbuthnot, slumped over the altar rail like a dog too tired to sin. Ghastly. And there's something odd, Peter." "Odd is such a pliable word? Odd like a square host, or odd like a bishop with a mistress?" They entered the vestry, a cold, dim room with stained glass shadows crawling across the tiled floor. In the far corner, half leaning against the north wall, was the late canon, a thick-set man in a black cassock, his face slack, tongue protruding slightly, as if he had expired mid-sermon. The room was quiet, save for the rustle of Bunter delicately removing his hat. Wimsey approached the body. His tone changed, growing crisp professional, if such a word could be applied to a man examining a corpse while quoting Marlowe. "Cut is the branch that might have grown full straight. Well now, no blood, no wounds, no immediate signs of mischief. Save, aha! Bunter, come here. Observe the fingertips." Bunter leaned in. "Yellowed, my lord, I should say from candle soot, unless he smoked cheroots, which would be most improper." Wimsey's eyes scanned the rest of the room. The stole had fallen askew. The chalice on the table glinted in the low light. A missal lay open to a Lenten prayer. And then his gaze paused. "Tell me, vicar," he said slowly, "do you always place the note on the altar?" "Note? What note?" Wimsey picked it up delicately with a pair of tweezers from his coat pocket. It was a small, folded scrap of paper, no larger than a communion wafer, tucked precisely beneath the silver crucifix. Bunter photographed it at once. Wimsey read it aloud, his voice lowering. "He knows the truth and bleeds for it. Forgive us." The vicar paled. "That was not there before, I swear it." "Well, I do believe you," Wimsey murmured, placing the note in an envelope. "If you were composing anonymous death poetry, I should think you'd employ better meter. But someone placed this here, likely after death." He turned back to the body. "Time of death, Constable?" Constable Meacham, a nervous man with the build of a retired jockey and the moustache of a walrus in mourning, shuffled forward. "Between 10 last night and 7 this morning, my lord. Locked doors all around. Only person seen on the grounds was a Sister Augustine from the convent down the lane. Took her morning walk round 5. Very pious, that one. Never looked in." "Sister Augustine," said Wimsey, turning the name over like a coin. "Is she the sort who walks with a guilty conscience, or merely penitential arches?" Meacham blinked. I don't rightly know, sir." Wimsey gave a thin smile. "No matter. We shall ask her. Never trust a nun who walks too early or a note left too late. Bunter, make a list of everyone with keys to the vestry. I should also like the canon's appointment book, any letters, and, if it's not too much to ask, his last sermon." "Very good, my lord." As they turned to leave, Wimsey paused, looking once more at the crucifix. He adjusted it minutely. "Always 3 inches to the right," he murmured. "Yet today, 4. "Surely," said Motherwell, "that means nothing." "Oh," said Wimsey, brushing his sleeve, "that depends entirely on whether the devil has a fondness for symmetry." And with that he stepped into the spring mist, trailing cigarette smoke and suspicion. The drizzle had turned to a sullen mist, curling like tobacco smoke about the stone eaves of the vicarage, as Wimsey and Bunter stepped once more inside. The drawing-room, if such it could be called without incurring libel, was stiflingly warm and faintly redolent of last year's peat and this morning's porridge. It was there that Mrs. Bracknell, housekeeper of some 30 years and facially arranged like an unresolved hymn, awaited them with a tray of tea that dared anyone to decline. "I thought," she said, with the quiet wrath of someone whose mornings had been upended by God and man alike, as his lordship might wish for refreshment. "Most kind," murmured Wimsey, inspecting the biscuits with an archaeologist's caution. "Tell me, Mrs. Bracknell, when did you last see the canon alive?" "Last night, sir, 8:30. He'd just finished with his rhubarb and was off to the vestry for his nightly prayers. Said he wouldn't be long, always the same." "And was he alone?" "Entirely, sir. I locked up after. No one else has a key, just the canon, and myself for cleaning, and Mr. Motherwell, of course." "No disturbances in the night? Unusual noises? Footsteps? Bells?" "Bells?" she sniffed. "Only the quarter chimes from the tower clock. Never stops, that one. I sleep next to it and barely hear a thing." Wimsey raised a brow. "Ah, a curious deafness. And you didn't hear the vestry bell ring?" Her chin lifted an imperceptible inch. "There's no vestry bell, my lord." Indeed. Bunter, do make a note. Mrs. Bracknell did not hear the bell which does not exist." He smiled, but there was something behind it, quiet interest, mild amusement, and calculation. It was then that the nun arrived. She was ushered in by Meacham, whose expression suggested he expected her to float. Sister Augustine, however, was disappointingly solid, in her early 40s, severe of posture, and possessed of a gaze that might have disapproved of sin but never misunderstood it. Her habit was neatly pressed, and her hands folded as if expecting blame. "I walk each morning," she said, without being asked. "From the convent to the river path and back, the Lord permits exercise so long as it is symmetrical." Wimsey bowed gallantly. "I dare say the Lord also permits observation, sister. Did you notice anything unusual this morning?" "I saw no one. I heard the quarter chimes. I passed the vestry at 5:07. The door was shut." "But unlocked?" "I did not test it, my lord." Yet you saw no light? None. Curious, and you did not hear a bell? Only the chimes. Wimsey steepled his fingers. Sister, forgive me a rude question. Have you ever met the canon, socially? Her eyes did not waver. Canon Arbuthnot dined at the convent once a month. He was correct. Never more than correct, never less. Excellent, said Wimsey. You are the very model of modern sanctity. May I ask, was your morning walk today delayed at all? No, but you left at 4:45 rather than your usual 5, did you not? There is a patch of mud by the west wall with a crisp boot mark not yet smudged by rain, and the convent clock is 5 minutes slow. For the first time, Sister Augustine hesitated. There was, a matter in the chapel, she admitted. I left early to clear my head. And did you perhaps encounter the canon on your way? No, she said too quickly. Wimsey inclined his head. Of course, that clears it all up. The sister left. Meacham followed her with a look suggesting he'd once failed at courtship by confusing chastity for challenge. Back in the vestry, Bunter had begun a subtle inventory. Wimsey examined the altar again, this time with unhurried patience. He drew a handkerchief and held it up to the silver crucifix, wiping the base. Dust. Only around the cross. Everything else was polished to a churchwarden's perfection. Bunter, he said, observe the alignment of the crucifix with the candlesticks, misplaced by an inch. Very good, my lord. And the note, tucked under the base, folded precisely. Suggests someone familiar with the room. He moved to the missal. Set to Lent, but the canon had told Motherwell he would be preparing a funeral homily. No funeral is scheduled, is it? Not to my knowledge, my lord. Then why rehearse the rites of the dead? There was a silence. Then Bunter said, unless he expected one. Outside, the clock struck 10. The bells tolled. Wimsey raised his head. Tell me, Bunter, if you were to ring the bell in the tower, how many minutes would it take for the sound to reach the drawing-room? Approximately 10 seconds, my lord, though the vestry is thicker-walled. One might not hear it at all if distracted. Yet Mrs. Bracknell said she heard nothing, neither did the nun, and Meacham heard no one. He tapped the note in his pocket. He knows the truth and bleeds for it. No blood, Bunter, but the tongue was protruding. Cyanosis. Possible. Could be poisoning. Wimsey knelt beside the body once more. The canon took no wine last night, only rhubarb. Bunter, did we inspect the teapot in the vicarage kitchen? I did, my lord. The pot was still warm, washed improperly, smelled faintly of almonds. The bitter almonds of justice. It seems the canon prepared his own absolution. Bunter looked up. Suicide, my lord? No, Wimsey said slowly. No one writes anonymous notes to themselves post-mortem. Someone wanted to frame remorse. There was a pause. Mrs. Bracknell, he said at last, has the keys. Sister Augustine lies about the timing, and yet neither had reason. But the note, it asks forgiveness, it pleads. Who pleads for another's soul unless they are the cause? He rose, brushing his knees. We must speak to Motherwell again. I fancy our priest has been rather more than merely correct. They left the vestry behind, the bells still echoing faintly in the walls, like something that had rung too early, or not at all. The Reverend Motherwell, when found again in his study, had resumed a pose of solemn pastoral concern, though the disarray of his collar and the faint scent of pipe ash betrayed nerves not yet settled. "You've spoken with the sister, then?" he asked, fingers twitching at the edge of a decanter he evidently wished were appropriate for the hour. "I have," said Wimsey, seating himself with the relaxed grace of a man about to strike a well-placed pawn. "A woman of profound piety and equally profound reticence. But let us turn, if you don't mind, to the matter of Canon Arbuthnot's relationships, or lack thereof." Motherwell grimaced. Not a popular man, I'm afraid. Doctrinally rigid, detested jazz in church halls, wrote letters to the Church Times about the dangers of electric lighting in chancels. The younger clergy thought him prehistoric. Still, he was unbending in all the right ways. Unbending men do tend to snap, murmured Wimsey. And what of enemies? None local. Well. The Reverend hesitated, then sighed. There was one man, a Mr. Guy Throgmorton, local artist, a touch modern, had a row with the canon over a memorial window. Arbuthnot refused it on aesthetic grounds. Was the glass objectionable? It depicted St. Sebastian with rather Greco-Roman proportions. The canon found it indecent. And Mr. Throgmorton made a scene at the vestry meeting, called Arbuthnot a tyrant, and threatened to break the church's silence with colour and truth, then stormed out. How delightfully prophetic. Bunter, who had re-entered with the canon's appointment book, cleared his throat. My lord, Mr. Throgmorton's name appears here. An entry for Tuesday last to GT 615 Vestry. Tuesday, said Wimsey. 2 days before the body was found? A reconciliation? Motherwell's brow furrowed. I was not told of any such meeting. Wimsey rose. Then perhaps Mr. Throgmorton will be kind enough to explain it himself. The artist's cottage was a short walk across the church green, ivy-covered with bright crimson shutters that seemed determined to scandalize the stone of the surrounding village. He answered the door in a smock that had once been white and now resembled a pallet, his hair unkempt and his expression wary. I'm not answering to any bloody committee again, he said, before noticing Wimsey's gloved hand and impeccable tailoring. Oh, sorry, thought you were the verger. I'm afraid not, said Wimsey pleasantly. Lord Peter Wimsey, I'm inquiring into the circumstances of Canon Arbuthnot's unfortunate demise. Throgmorton blinked. Didn't know he had any circumstances, thought he'd keel over from boredom. Ah, said Wimsey, but boredom rarely leaves notes. And you, Mr. Throgmorton, were one of the last people to see him alive. The artist's smirk vanished. I spoke to him on Tuesday. I told him I'd found a way to tone down the Sebastian. Window made it symbolic, abstract, less flesh, more flame. He was unmoved. Yet you persisted? I left a sketch. He said he'd consider it, that's all. You threatened him before. Only artistically, said Throgmorton with a flash of teeth. I dare say half the parish would have liked him gone, but not enough to do the job themselves. Besides, I was at the pub on Wednesday night. The entire bell-ringing society saw me. Wimsey's eyes narrowed. Pub? The Crown and Cauldron? Monthly meeting. We all drank and argued about peels until midnight. Loudly. Bunter scribbled a note. You don't strike me as a man drawn to bells, Wimsey said. I don't ring them, said Throgmorton. I paint them, but they serve good ale. Indeed. And Sister Augustine, does she drink? Not a drop. She's more likely to exercise the pumps. Back outside, Wimsey paused beneath the creeping fog. Well, Bunter? A man with motive, my lord. Artistic humiliation, public dispute, known temper. Yes, said Wimsey, lighting a cigarette. But rather too fond of being noticed, loud, vivid, unable to keep secrets. The kind of man who kills, perhaps, but not the kind who tucks poetic notes under crucifixes or poisons teapots with cyanide. He's a red herring, and a crimson one at that. Then we return to the vestry, my lord. Not yet. We return to the bells. They climbed the spiral stair of the bell tower, the stone damp underfoot, and the air heavy with the scent of pigeon and iron. At the top, Wimsey ran his hand along the ropes. This tower was used Wednesday night. Yes, my lord, said Bunter. The peal at 6, but none after. Then how was a bell heard, if it was heard, by Sister Augustine around 5? Wimsey crouched and examined the clapper. a faint smear of something, dark, resinous, unnatural. "Bunter," he said, "take a sample of this." "I suspect we've found our first performance." "What would they have done, my lord?" "Rung it once, quietly, then set the bell to remain in swing, without striking. A deception." "But why?" "To construct a sound that wasn't heard, a bell that should have rung. Someone is playing with time." They descended in silence. Back in the drawing-room, Wimsey stared once more at the appointment book. The canon's final entries were neat, orderly, but the last entry, blank. No name, no hour, just a line drawn across the page like a cancelled confession. "I wonder," Wimsey murmured, "who that was meant for. Someone whose name he dared not write, or perhaps someone he had already forgiven." He tapped the page. "Bunter, I believe it's time we returned to the convent." The mist outside had thickened, and the bells, those ever-faithful markers of time, remained silent. The convent of St. Eustacia of the Holy Fire stood on a gentle rise east of the village, enclosed by low stone walls and guarded not so much by gates as by a palpable air of disciplined serenity. Wimsey approached with the caution of a man who had once, in some youthfully misjudged hour, corrected a nun's Latin and lived to regret it. Bunter rang the bell, which emitted a modest chime like a guilty conscience, and presently the door was opened by a pale young postulant who looked as though she had never been startled in her life. "Lord Peter Wimsey, to see Sister Augustine," said Bunter, with his usual apologetic authority. The young woman bowed and vanished. They were shown to a small parlour with ecclesiastical furniture and a potted aspidistra that had either taken a vow of silence or simply died in protest. Wimsey wandered the room, idly adjusting a candlestick, tapping the rim of a blue porcelain saucer, and peering behind a curtain as though expecting to find a confessional. "Tell me, Bunter," he said quietly, "have you ever noticed how convents smell of beeswax and secrets?" "I could not say, my lord." "Ah, but you could. You simply won't." Sister Augustine entered, more composed than she had been that morning. She made the sign of the cross, which Wimsey returned with an inclination of his head and a smile that hovered just shy of irreverence. "Sister," he said, "forgive the intrusion. I've come to discuss, of all things, your garden." She blinked just once. "My lord? Your garden, or rather your gardener, you have none?" "We do not employ one. The sisters tend the earth." "Marvellous unity of spirit and compost, but someone pruned the west hedge yesterday, and very recently, unless I mistake the cuttings near the gate." "Curious timing, wouldn't you say?" "On the very day the canon met his end." She folded her hands. "That was Sister Benedicta. We rotate duties." "And does Sister Benedicta keep a pair of boots approximately size 9, rubber-soled, with a slight inward wear at the heel?" Sister Augustine's composure cracked, a flicker, but definite. "I don't know." "I do," said Wimsey, producing a small photograph Bunter had taken of the footprint outside the vestry. "We found this near the west wall of the church, made around dawn. Many walk that way. But many hesitate, then retreat. The ground shows it clearly. Approach, pause, withdraw. I rather think someone meant to enter the vestry but changed her mind." She was silent. "Tell me," Wimsey continued lightly, "do you know why the canon was preparing a funeral homily?" Her mouth parted slightly. "A funeral?" "There is no funeral scheduled, no one dead but the canon himself, and yet the missal was open to the rite of burial, unless, of course, he was rehearsing his own departure?" "I cannot say." "Then let me say it. He was meeting someone who had confessed to him, someone whose conscience had grown burdensome." "I think," said Sister Augustine with great precision, You are mistaken. Wimsey smiled. I usually am, until I'm not. You see, the canon wrote nothing in his book for that final appointment. But the entry is there, a line drawn deliberately. He expected someone whose name he did not wish others to read. Then it could have been anyone. Not quite. It had to be someone who could enter without suspicion. Someone who could be seen near the vestry at an early hour. Someone above suspicion cloaked in piety. I dare say even Constable Meacham would ignore a nun. She stood still, her expression unreadable. Why are you really here, my lord? To ask about bells. The vestry bell, specifically. There is no vestry bell. Indeed, and yet one was heard, or rather wasn't heard, when it ought to have been. It's a clever trick, you know, ringing a bell in the tower at an unusual time, then letting it swing noiselessly to create the illusion of silence, a silence in which a murder may pass unnoticed. Murder? Let us say assisted death. You see, the canon was poisoned, a dose of cyanide, likely taken in his evening tea, but someone made certain the cup was washed. Poorly, but just enough. Who, I wonder? No one in this convent. But you knew he was dying, didn't you? You watched, or arrived too late, and then placed the note. Her face paled. You're wrong. Am I? Wimsey moved closer, voice softening. Then forgive me, I asked too many questions. I must be getting old. Bunter, did we ever find the canon's copy of Meditations on Sin and Contrition? No, my lord, it was missing from the shelf. I suspect it's here, said Wimsey, gesturing to the convent walls. The canon visited often enough. Perhaps he lent it. Perhaps he marked something. A page, a passage. Sister Augustine's hands tightened. Wimsey leaned in. What did he know, sister? What did you confess? She said nothing, but her silence rang louder than any bell. Outside, the clouds broke for a moment and cast a shaft of sunlight onto the convent lawn, illuminating a row of carefully clipped hedges, and just beyond them a garden bench beneath which, if one were to look, might still be found a folded cloth handkerchief bearing the initials J. A. Wimsey, stepped back and gave a courteous bow. Thank you, sister. You've been most enlightening. As they left, Bunter asked, Do you believe she poisoned him, my lord? No, said Wimsey, but she watched him die and then tried to make sense of it all. A nun who wrote poetry once, perhaps, or who once loved something or someone enough to lie. And the bell? Ah, said Wimsey, stepping lightly over a puddle. That is the question, isn't it? Someone went to great trouble to create confusion where there ought to have been clarity, which means we are close, Bunter. Very close. The moment we understand why the time of death mattered, we shall know who made it. Matter. The mist had thinned now, but the mystery had only deepened. Wimsey smiled, almost wistfully. I do love a vestry, he said. Such dreadful acoustics for truth. The morning had sharpened considerably by the time Wimsey and Bunter returned to the vicarage. The lingering mist had lifted, revealing the weathered stones of All Souls Church with a clarity that made every flaw, every mark of time feel more pronounced. Wimsey, however, was no more convinced of clarity than he had been in the cloistered gloom of the convent. Bunter, he said, unfolding the canon's appointment book once again. The last entry, blank but for that drawn line, is a peculiar thing. Someone meant it to be read, yet wished to obscure its meaning. We must test the timeline rigorously. Bunter nodded, pulling from his pocket a neatly folded map of the village and environs. The canon was last seen alive about 8:30 p.m. Wednesday and found dead early Thursday morning. The poison, as you suggested, could have been administered any time after tea. Indeed. Yet our witnesses are unanimous that no one entered the vestry after the canon retired there. Except, of course, the mysterious visitor noted by the blank entry. Precisely, and that is where the bells come in. The peal on Wednesday night was scheduled for 6 p.m. and concluded before midnight. No bells were rung between those hours, at least not officially. Wimsey tapped the appointment book again. Mr. Throgmorton's alibi places him loudly in the Crown and Cauldron from 9:30 onwards, so we can discount him. Bunter frowned. Sister Augustine's early morning walk was unaccounted for precisely because the convent clock runs 5 minutes slow. It gives a margin of error to her statement about seeing no one at 5:07. Exactly so. But more interesting is Mrs. Bracknell's claim that she heard no vestry bell, and the fact that there is no vestry bell to hear. Wimsey rose, moving toward the church entrance. Bunter, we shall test the distance from the bell tower to every witness who claims to have heard, or not heard, the chimes. Outside, the church bell tower loomed like a silent sentinel. Wimsey set his watch and began pacing from the base of the tower toward the vicarage, timing each step with precise measures. Bunter recorded the times diligently. From the tower to the drawing room, 11 seconds for sound to carry. And the vestry is further behind thick walls. 15 seconds, my lord. Mrs. Bracknell's quarters lie within that radius, yet she heard nothing, so either the bell was not rung or was muffled. They next visited the Crown and Cauldron. The landlord confirmed that Throgmorton had been present from 9 till after midnight, loudly enough to disturb even the most inebriated among the patrons. Wimsey asked about other villagers. "Only Meacham," said the landlord. "He left early around 10, saying he had duties, but he was quiet as a mouse. Didn't hear a thing unusual. The constable himself was summoned." "You say you heard no bell, constable?" "Not one, my lord, and I'm on patrol all night." "Yet, Meacham, the bell tower is within your patrol beat." "Yes, but I was near the river. Sound doesn't travel so well through water and fog." "Good," said Wimsey. "And what of the vestry door? Is it soundproof?" The constable shrugged. "It's thick oak, but no one installed soundproofing." Someone was cautious. Back at the vestry, Wimsey examined the walls and windows more closely, tapping the stone with a gloved knuckle. The leaded glass in the stained window was cracked, a faint line tracing a spiderweb pattern, unnoticed by the others, but to Wimsey's keen eye, a telling sign. A bell sound or a call could have been muffled here, or diverted. He moved to the altar rail, tracing the length with a finger. The canon's body was found with the tongue protruding, sign of cyanide poisoning, suffocation, or perhaps nerve agent. The time of death must be narrowed. Bunter, have you compiled the witness statements with their exact times and locations? All in order, my lord. The only anomaly is the absence of anyone seen entering or leaving the vestry after 8:30 p.m., save Sister Augustine's unexplained early morning walk, which we've established may have an error margin due to her convent clock. Wimsey paused, his gaze sharpening. I believe the killer relied on this margin. They exploited the fog, the shifting clocks, the thickness of doors, and the trust in routine to create a window in time wide enough to commit murder unnoticed. He looked out the vestry window. Dawn was breaking, pale and uncertain. And the note, he added softly, placed after death to confuse and mislead. Bunter nodded. So the timeline is a carefully constructed lie. Exactly. And the question remains, who was the invisible visitor that night? Who moved unseen between 8:30 and dawn? Wimsey pocketed the appointment book. Tomorrow, we shall examine the canon's past more closely. Until then, Bunter, consider this. The killer is not merely a criminal, but a master of deception and psychological cruelty. Bunter gave a low whistle. "Quite so, Bunter, and it is this cruelty that fascinates me most." The churchyard was bathed now in the pale gold of morning, but the shadows in the corners of All Souls still whispered secrets. Wimsey lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a silent question mark. The following afternoon, Wimsey found himself seated opposite Reverend Motherwell once more, this time in the vicarage study, the room cluttered with books on canon law, worn leather chairs, and the faint aroma of pipe tobacco mingled with old paper. The heavy drapes were drawn against the low sun, casting everything in a half-light that seemed fitting for the conversation. "Peter," Motherwell began, stirring his tea with a tremulous hand, "I confess there is something I haven't told you, something I only discovered this morning." Wimsey raised an eyebrow, signalling the freedom to continue. "The canon led a double life." "Oh?" said Wimsey, gently amused. "Pray, do enlighten me. The good Reverend Father Arbuthnot, moonlighting as a burglar, or perhaps a phantom organist?" Motherwell shook his head. "Nothing so theatrical, but deeply troubling. Letters have come to light, correspondence between the canon and a woman in London." Miss Joanna Ainsley Wimsey's fingers twitched slightly. "Joanna Ainsley, the initials on the handkerchief in the convent garden, I believe." "Precisely. A lady of some society standing, connected, discreet, and until now entirely unknown to the parish. It appears the canon had been maintaining this liaison for several years." "Fascinating. And what of this Miss Ainsley, a scandalous seductress, a scheming adventuress, or merely a lonely woman?" Motherwell poured himself another cup. "She describes a troubled marriage, a husband distant and cold. The letters hint at promises of escape, of new life elsewhere." Wimsey leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Does she mention the canon in less than glowing terms?" "On the contrary, her tone is affectionate, though tinged with fear. She writes of threats received, shadows stalking her London residence." "Threats from whom?" "That is unknown, but she implores the canon to be cautious." Wimsey's eyes darkened. "And the canon himself? Did he speak of these fears?" Motherwell hesitated. "He confided only to me that he feared his past was catching up with him, that his sins were not solely of this parish." "Quite," said Wimsey. "This double life suggests a man torn between duty and desire, a psychological battleground ripe for tragedy." He took from his pocket the handkerchief with the initials J.A. "And here is a token of that life, left within sight, yet hidden beneath a convent stone." Motherwell sighed. "I had hoped to keep this secret buried, for the sake of the parish and the woman." "But secrets have a way of rising," Wimsey murmured, "especially when death is involved." He rose, pacing the room. "This changes everything. The visitor at the vestry could well have been Joanna Ainsley, someone with the access, motive, and emotional stakes." Motherwell shook his head. "Joanna is in London. I telephoned her. She denies any involvement." "Denial is the first act of a desperate play." Wimsey smiled thinly. "Or an alibi." Bunter entered with a file of the canon's letters, yellowed and carefully folded. Wimsey scanned them quickly, words of longing, fear, plans to elope, threats of exposure. Then tucked within a peculiar note, "He watches. The past is not silent. Forgive me if I cannot meet." Wimsey folded the papers with a slow deliberation. "This adds a new dimension. The psychological manipulation we suspected may be external, not just internal. Someone is tormenting both the canon and his lover." Motherwell looked grim. "You think Joanna might be in danger? Or the canon was protecting her by sacrificing himself?" The thought hung in the air. Wimsey's mind raced through the facts. The missing book from the convent, the altered clocks, the staged bell sounds, the anonymous note. The killer may have sought to punish the canon for this secret liaison. A jealous spouse, a blackmailer, or a scorned parishioner. "Do you intend to question Miss Ainslie again?" "I shall," said Wimsey, "and I shall seek to understand what truth the note's author claims to know." He knows the truth and bleeds for it. The words echo a tortured conscience. Motherwell, pale and weary, nodded. Wimsey lit a cigarette, eyes distant. "The story deepens, Bunter. A man's life split between piety and passion, and death a dark punctuation." Bunter responded with a solemn nod. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the yew trees and the shadows lengthened with portent. The fog returned that evening, low and clinging to the earth like something ancient and breathing. Wimsey stood alone by the broken bell tower, a lantern in one hand, the other in his coat pocket, fingers turning over the tiny gear he'd found beneath the nave pew days ago. A mechanism no larger than a coin, but vital and increasingly significant. The tower's crumbling stones loomed over him. The bell rope, still unused and coiled, swung slightly in the breeze, though no wind touched his face. It was a curious illusion. Behind him, footsteps sounded on the wet path. "My lord," came Bunter's voice emerging from the mist. "Miss Ainslie has arrived. She's waiting in the vicarage drawing room." Wimsey said nothing for a long moment, then softly, "So she did come?" "She did," Bunter confirmed, handing him an envelope. "And she brought this." Wimsey opened it. Inside was a photograph, black and white, somewhat faded, of the canon standing beside a woman, Joanna, outside what appeared to be a seaside inn. The date on the back read Summer 1926. "Weeks before the threats began," Wimsey murmured. She told Motherwell she hadn't seen him in months. He pocketed the photo and strode toward the vicarage, boots muffled by the moss. Joanna Ainslie was waiting by the hearth, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes sharp beneath a fashionable hat. The room smelled of wood smoke and cloves. "Miss Ainslie," he said with a gentle bow, "forgive the gloom and the questions." "I expected both," she said, "though I had hoped for less suspicion." "And yet you came. That speaks well of your conscience, if not your comfort." She didn't smile. Wimsey took the opposite chair, gesturing toward the photograph. "This contradicts what you told Reverend Motherwell." She studied it briefly. "I was afraid. I thought if I admitted how recently we had met, I would be blamed. For the canon's death? For pushing him into choices he could not carry." Wimsey tilted his head. "And did you?" Her eyes gleamed. "Number we were planning to leave. He'd resigned himself to the scandal. He said he would tell Motherwell everything. Wimsey absorbed this. Yet he never did." She nodded, silent. "I wonder," Wimsey said, "if someone else learned of your plans. Someone who could not bear the canon's departure, who saw in his defection a betrayal not just of station, but of affection." Joanna frowned. "You think one of the servants?" "Perhaps, or someone even closer." He stood, pacing slowly. There is an hour between 6:15 and 7:15 on the night of the canon's death that no one can truly account for. The bells were heard at 6:30, yet the clock in the convent was later found to be off by 15 minutes. The vespers, normally attended to by Sister Edith, were conducted in haste. Servants claimed to have heard the canon walking in the vestry at 6:45, and yet he was likely already dead. Joanna paled. "Then the bells rung by someone else, deliberately, to confuse the timeline." He returned to his chair, voice low and deliberate. The killer created an illusion of presence, of ritual, of routine. But they overlooked the finer details. The gear found under the pew. It belonged to the convent's small bell tower mechanism. I believe it was tampered with to ring automatically, rigged earlier in the day. Joanna sat stiffly, lips parted but no words coming. And then, Wimsey continued, someone else moved the canon's body. The posture was too carefully composed. The blood beneath him had already begun to congeal before he was set upright in the vestry chair. At last, she asked, "Why go to such lengths? To protect someone or to frame someone?" But I believe it was love or obsession that motivated the killer, not vengeance. Someone who knew the canon intimately, someone who felt abandoned, betrayed. Joanna's face remained expressionless, but her fingers trembled in her lap. Wimsey stood. "One last thing, Miss Ainsley, where were you at the time of his death?" "I told you, in London. I was—" He raised a hand gently. "Forgive me, but your hotel in Chelsea reported you did not check in until the following morning. The train from Brackham to London takes just under 4 hours. You had ample time to return." Her eyes shimmered. "I came to say goodbye. I thought he might change his mind." Wimsey nodded. "And did he?" "I don't know. I waited by the bell tower. I saw him enter the vestry. I left before anyone else arrived." She rose. "I didn't kill him." "No," said Wimsey softly. "But I believe you know who did." Her silence gave him the answer. Or later, that night, in the silence of the empty nave, Wimsey returned to the vestry. He traced his hand along the wood of the prayer bench. The illusion had nearly been perfect, a crime cloaked in devotion, a death disguised as prayer. But the missing hour could not be erased. The gear, the photo, the misplaced clock hands, all pointed to careful planning born of conflicted affection. Someone had tried to stop time, to preserve a sacred lie. Wimsey whispered to the shadows, "All that is hidden must surface." And the wind outside carried the whisper back, soft and sure. Morning came shrouded in grey. The moors were veiled in low cloud, and a fine, cold drizzle fell like memory upon the roofs of Brackham Vicarage. Inside, Lord Peter Wimsey stood at the window of the drawing-room, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the convent. It loomed like a memory, not quite buried. He had spent the early hours with Bunter, poring over transcripts and testimonies, rereading the canon's personal letters and sorting through relics of a life torn between God and the heart. There was one more place he had to go. "The sisters will not speak to you again," said Bunter gently as Wimsey pulled on his coat. "I suspect they never truly have," Wimsey replied, his voice distant. "But there's one who might listen." The path to the convent was slick with dew. The gates opened with a groan as he approached, and a silent sister escorted him to the cloister garden, where Sister Edith sat beneath a twisted apple tree, her rosary beads clutched between pale fingers. She looked up at him. Her face bore the stillness of someone long used to silence, but there was recognition in her eyes. "May I?" Wimsey asked. She nodded once. He sat beside her on the damp bench. For a moment, he said nothing. "I believe," he began softly, "that you loved him." She inhaled sharply, a tremor passing through her. "You knew him before the cloth," he continued. "Before the canon became the canon. You knew the man beneath the cassock." She looked away, fingers tightening on the rosary. "You left the world to be near him, perhaps not in flesh but in spirit, and for years that was enough, until Joanna returned." Wimsey placed the small photograph on the stone beside them. "I wonder what it was like, watching them rekindle what you thought had been buried." Did it feel like a betrayal? Or simply a reminder that your vows could not bind his soul? Tears welled in her eyes, but did not fall. He came to you that night, didn't he? After Vespers, confused, torn. He told you he meant to leave. She turned slowly, lips parting. And in that moment you believed he would fall again, that he would throw away decades of devotion for a fleeting, worldly love. You begged him to reconsider, but he was already gone in spirit. Her voice came at last, no louder than breath. He said he was tired. Wimsey nodded gently. You saw the end approaching. You could not bear to lose him, not to the world, not to her. So you tried to preserve him. She shook her head, but Wimsey continued. You didn't kill him. You found him already gone. Heart failure, perhaps, or something similar. He died in solitude, in torment. Now the tears fell. And so you composed him, Wimsey whispered. You placed him as if in prayer. You rang the bells so the timing would seem perfect. You wound the mechanism to cover the hour. Her voice cracked. He deserved peace. He did, Wimsey agreed quietly. But he also deserved truth. A long silence settled between them, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves and the slow ticking of the convent's distant clock. You loved him, Wimsey said again, and your silence has been loud ever since. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she reached into her sleeve and withdrew a folded letter. For her, she said. Wimsey took it. The parchment was fragile, the handwriting unmistakable. A final confession. Back in the vicarage, Wimsey sat by the fire, reading the canon's last letter aloud to Bunter. My dear Joanna, I cannot follow you. I cannot follow him. I find myself between two altars and no light upon either. The years have weathered my spirit. I once believed in clarity. Now I only know doubt. If you read this, know that I loved you once, and perhaps always did. But love has become a mirror, and I no longer see myself in it. Wimsey folded the letter, expression unreadable. No killer, Bunter said quietly. No, Wimsey murmured, only those left behind. That evening, Wimsey walked again to the bell tower. The sky above was breaking into slashes of amber and blue. The fog was lifting at last. The vicarage was quiet. The convent was still. Bells rang out once more, not deceitful this time, but solemn, steady. Truth had emerged not with a revelation, but with a reckoning. The canon had died not by violence, but by sorrow. And those who had loved him, in their own broken ways, had tried to keep a piece of him from the darkness. Wimsey removed his hat and bowed his head. Some crimes leave no blood, only silence. Evening came with the hush of final things. Lord Peter Wimsey stood once more on the threshold of Brackham Vicarage, the sun setting behind the moor in a wash of gold and violet. It was as if the whole landscape were exhaling the secrets it had held for too long. The fire in the study was low, the house was still, save for the occasional creak of old beams and the ticking of the grandfather clock that had marked each revelation in patient time. Across from him sat Mrs. March, her eyes red-rimmed but composed. Joanna Bell stood beside the fireplace, the canon's final letter held tightly in her hand, unread but deeply felt. Sister Edith had returned to the convent without protest. She had not asked forgiveness. She had only bowed her head. Bunter, ever discreet, stood by the door, waiting. I thought, Mrs. March said at last, that it would be simpler, that it would be the groundskeeper or some scorned lunatic, something simple and monstrous. Wimsey offered a faint smile. The most monstrous things, he said, are often born of love. He moved to the mantel, lifting a small carving of St. Dunstan. Behind it, tucked into a crack in the panelling, he retrieved the canon's signet ring. He'd meant to leave, Wimsey said softly. To retire. To step away from both callings, the church, and perhaps even Joanna. But the weight of his choices, it pressed inward. Joanna finally spoke, her voice dry. He had doubts. He had devotions, Wimsey replied. To you, once. To his calling. To the peace he hoped might outlast either. He turned toward her. He loved you, enough to walk away again. She bowed her head. I was foolish to come back. No, Wimsey said gently. You were brave. There was silence then, the quiet of rooms settling, of grief being portioned into manageable shapes. Outside, the rain had stopped. Wimsey sipped his now cold tea. What remains is for the coroner, of course. Natural causes, heart failure, but that isn't the whole of it. The truth seldom is. Mrs. March stared into the fire. The bell rope, she murmured. The locks, the wound clock. I feel like I'm still missing pieces. You are, Wimsey agreed. We all are. Truth, you see, is rarely a singular artifact. It is layers, glimpses, shadows. The canon died alone, but his legacy was handled by many hands, each with love or guilt or fear shaping what came after. Joanna slowly unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the words, and her shoulders fell in that quiet way sorrow settles, not suddenly but inevitably. I loved him still, she whispered. Even now, even this. Wimsey rose. There is nothing more to uncover, he said, only to carry. Later that night, in his guest chamber, Wimsey sat cross-legged on the bed while Bunter laid out his travel coat and umbrella. Well, Wimsey said, lighting a cigarette, it wasn't the most dramatic ending, was it? No, my lord, Bunter replied. But it was terribly human. Wimsey exhaled a plume of smoke toward the ceiling. No one to jail, no culprit to denounce, just broken hearts and bells rung in the wrong hour. There is some justice in that, Bunter offered. Perhaps, Wimsey said, though I dare say it won't make a thrilling headline. He turned his head toward the window. Beyond the panes the moon had risen full, casting the moor in soft silver light. You know, Bunter, he said quietly, sometimes I think we search for murderers when all we really find is grief dressed in strange clothes. Yes, my lord. At the railway platform the next morning, Wimsey stood beneath his hat, his hands in his pockets. Mrs. March had come to see him off, her usual iron composure softened by fatigue. I never properly thanked you, she said. I didn't really solve anything, he replied. You revealed it. That's more than enough. They shook hands. Take care of the vicarage, he said. It deserves quieter years. She nodded. And the bells? They'll ring again, she said. But only on the hour. Wimsey smiled. That's something. The train arrived in a gust of steam and clatter. As he boarded, he turned once more to look across the moor. The convent stood still and pale in the morning light. Somewhere within, Sister Edith knelt in silent prayer. Somewhere behind her closed eyes, memory stirred. He sat by the window as the train pulled away, the countryside unfolding in slow rhythm. Case closed, but the echoes of it, the bell, the broken hearts, the silence, those would linger, because some mysteries aren't solved, they are simply understood. And Lord Peter Wimsey, for all his cleverness and charm, had always known the difference. Months passed, the year turned, and Brackham Moor receded beneath a blanket of snow and silence. The village resumed its habitual rhythm, small, faithful, and forgetful. The canon's death, once whispered through tearful suppers and behind hastily closed doors, became memory, shapeless, blurred by time. But the vicarage remembered. Mrs. March kept the study tidy, the canon's chair preserved, the fire tended. She preached in soft, even tones on Sundays, never taking the pulpit as her own, but holding it until another permanent vicar would come. The bells, repaired and rebalanced, rang gently at each hour now, never a moment too soon or late. Joanna Bell left quietly one morning, as quietly as she had arrived. She did not say goodbye. She walked down the long path leading to the station, the same way she had first come. No luggage, save for a single bag and a folded letter she carried close to her chest. She had read it many times. She would read it many times more. The canon's words had been brief and apologetic, laden with love and burden. He had not asked forgiveness, he had only offered truth. In the letter he had written of silence, of how he had felt it envelop him in his final weeks, not the silence of peace, but of reckoning. The silence of standing in the shadow of one's past and knowing the weight of what could not be undone. And yet even in that silence he had thought of her. Joanna boarded the train without looking back. Back in London, Lord Peter Wimsey returned to his habits. The clatter of the city felt almost jarring after Brackham's quietude. The cases he took were clever, less weighted by sorrow, more by wit. Bunter resumed his duties with precise ease, never speaking of Brackham unless spoken to. But sometimes, in the hush between rainfalls, Wimsey would think of the bell tower, the dust-covered hymnals, the woman in the chapel, whispering prayers to a God she both served and feared. He would think of Sister Edith. She had written him once on thick paper, edged with faint gold. The letter had been brief. She wrote that she had been allowed to remain within the convent, though no longer in a role of authority. Her penance was prayer and silence, a silence freely chosen this time. She ended the letter with a line from the book of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. Wimsey had folded the letter and placed it inside the copy of Don's sermons that rested on his bookshelf, and the canon's grave was simple. A modest headstone near the edge of the churchyard beneath an old yew tree. The inscription bore only his name, his dates, and a single line below. He sang the bells and bore their weight. Once a week, Mrs. March would lay a sprig of rosemary beside the stone. Sometimes she brought daffodils. On rare occasions she would find others had done the same, silent tributes, unspoken griefs. There were no further investigations. The coroner's report had cited natural causes. No criminal inquiries were reopened. The world, content with tidy explanations, moved on. Only a few knew the full truth, and even among them the truths differed. In a private club near Piccadilly over brandy and quiet conversation, Charles Parker asked Wimsey, "Do you think it ever mattered?" "That you figured it out, I mean." Wimsey twirled his glass slowly. "To whom?" "To anyone. He died all the same." The woman went back to her cloister, the girl left. The bells still ring. Wimsey smiled faintly. "It mattered to me, not because I wanted justice. There was none to be had, but because I hate not knowing. I hate false shapes." Parker raised an eyebrow. "But the world's full of false shapes." "Yes," Wimsey said, "which is why I keep slicing through them, one by one." He paused, then added, "Also, it was a damn fine bell tower." The tale of the canon and the bell never became a novel. Harriet Vane, when told of the affair, called it too melancholy, too quiet for drama, but she did write a short story later published anonymously in a literary journal. It bore no names, only moods. She called it The Ninth Hour. It was a meditation, not a mystery. A story about a man who kept time for others, even as his own unraveled. And so the bell in Brackham Moor tolled on, not out of rhythm now, but steady. A part of the land, a part of memory. Children no longer ran past the vicarage in fear, they ran past in games. The chapel no longer felt haunted, it felt ancient. The truth, once await, became dust. And Lord Peter Wimsey, seated in his chair by the fire one late December night, read the letter one last time, then burned it, not out of guilt or secrecy, but because sometimes a flame was the only way to let go. Time, indifferent as it is, does not erase. It buries. And like the bell that slumbers beneath a steeple, some echoes do not cease. They merely soften, becoming part of the air. In the decades that followed the cannon's passing, Brackham Moor remained small. New vicars came and went. The pews changed faces. The liturgy evolved in subtle ways, adapting to new prayers and new tongues. But the bell always rang at its appointed hour. Some said it rang clearer now, as though it had been freed of some unseen drag, some sorrow that had once dulled its song. Mrs. March stayed on until her bones could no longer brave the moorland winters. She moved into a quiet cottage near Bath, cared for by a niece who loved gardening and disliked conversation. But every Sunday morning, she would still wake early, open her window, and imagine the distant sound of bells from a place she would always call home. Joanna Bell became a nurse during the war. She served not as a soldier of arms, but of healing, tending to wounds and carrying whispered final words from broken men to trembling families. She did not return to Brackham. She kept no photographs of the village, but once, in a letter to a friend, she wrote, "There was a church once, and a man who kept the bells. I think I left a piece of myself there, though I am not sure it belonged to me anymore." Sister Edith never wrote again. The convent records indicate she remained in solitude until her death in 1946, her name rarely spoken outside its stone walls. But a visiting bishop once noted in his diary that there was a sister whose prayers carry the weight of centuries, and some wondered if that had been her. As for Lord Peter Wimsey, he lived a full life. He married, he fathered children, he took on fewer cases and more poetry. He walked daily in Hyde Park and read Donne aloud to himself in the bath. The memory of Brackham Moor was not often raised aloud, even with Harriet, but it settled somewhere deep in his mind, like a favoured line from a long-forgotten poem. Sometimes, when the hour struck 9, he would pause, just briefly, and listen. Not because he expected to hear the bell, but because something in him still knew how it had once sounded, that particular timbre, that subtle hesitation between peal and fall. One final note recorded in a parish journal by an elderly verger. In the spring of '52, a man came through the village asking about the canon who died here, said he was a writer, not English, wore a coat too long for the season, asked to see the church, asked to sit alone by the bell tower. He stayed an hour. He left no name, just said, "The note is still true." No one knows who he was, but that's the thing about echoes. They return when least expected. And in the church's western wall, there is now a small plaque. Weather-worn, modest. It reads, "To all who bear the weight of silence, and yet choose to ring the bell. No dates, no names, only that. Some say the canon would have liked it, others say he would have objected to the sentimentality. Perhaps both are true." There is no final moral to this tale, no universal chord struck and held, only the quiet assurance that the world turns and turns again. That sorrow, when spoken, becomes story, and stories, when told with care, become something more than grief. They become remembrance, and remembrance, like a bell, must be rung to be heard. So let it ring, let it echo, let it become, in the end, a kind of peace, The train had just slipped away from the station when Wimsey lit his last cigar of the day, a delicate curl of smoke spiraling into the cool evening air. Bunter sat opposite him, eyes fixed on the rolling countryside as dusk surrendered to night. "I dare say, Bunter," Wimsey began, his voice a low murmur, "there is a certain poetry in a mystery that refuses to be solved like a crossword, more like a sonnet, with ellipses and pauses where one expects exclamation points." Bunter nodded, accustomed to his master's literary metaphors. "It was a case of human frailty rather than criminal cunning, my lord." "Precisely," Wimsey replied, tapping ash into the tray. "A man caught between his sacred vows and earthly desires. No villain, no hero, just a man muddling through." He paused, eyes tracing the outlines of the stars emerging in the navy sky. "I suspect that's the truest sort of crime, that of love and silence." Bunter smiled faintly. "And the bells, my lord? Will they ever cease their toll?" Wimsey chuckled softly. "No, old friend. The bells, like our own shadows, will follow us to the end. Sometimes they ring out in joy, sometimes in sorrow, but always in time. And time, as we know, waits for no man." He leaned back, exhaling the smoke with the air of a man who had laid down a burden and found a measure of peace. "Tell me, Bunter, did I ever properly thank you for your indefatigable assistance?" "Only this morning, my lord," Bunter replied dryly. "Ah, then I suppose I must content myself with gratitude deferred." The carriage rattled onward, carrying them away from Brackham Moor, its mysteries now folded quietly into memory. "Do you think, Peter," Bunter ventured, "that some cases change us more than others?" "Indeed, Bunter," Wimsey said, "and this one has reminded me that beneath every polished surface lies some imperfection. Sometimes that imperfection is not a flaw to be excised, but a story to be understood." He glanced toward the window where the faint outline of a distant church spire lingered in the moonlight. "Let us hope the cannon rests at last, and the bells toll only for the living." Bunter offered a subtle nod, and the two men settled into companionable silence, the steady rhythm of the wheels beneath them marking the passage of hours and the closing of a chapter. As the train carried them away, the moor lay still, the bell tower no longer shrouded in mystery, but instead quietly part of the land's enduring heartbeat. Lord Peter Wimsey smiled to himself, the faintest trace of irony lingering on his lips. "After all," he mused, "if life is a puzzle, then I prefer the pieces that make us pause and think, rather than those that snap together too neatly." With that, he flicked the cigar's ember into the ashtray and closed his eyes, content in the knowledge that some stories end not with a bang but a bell's soft toll, and that was quite enough.